Welcome back, everyone. This is our second episode for Moses. Guys, Moses has a crazy life. To quickly recap last week, baby Moses is sent down the river. He is sent down the river by his own mother in order to protect him. As backward as that sounds, his mom is trying to protect him from Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh has ordered that all baby Israelite boys be killed, and Moses is one of those baby boys. So in order to protect him, his mother sends him down the river, and by the grace of God, Moses survives. Not only is Moses safe, but he's also floated directly into Pharaoh's daughter's bathhouse. Now, that might seem like a bad thing since, Pharaoh's trying to kill Israelite babies, but this turns out to be a good thing because Pharaoh's daughter takes pity on Moses. She sees a lost child and she feels bad for him, and she adopts him as her own. And God doesn't stop there. Pharaoh's daughter is nervous about taking care of an Israelite child all on her own. So she calls in Moses' own mother to come and babysit and basically be a nanny for Moses. What we see is that God has been watching after Moses this entire time. And the cool thing is, this is only the beginning of Moses' journey. So let's see what God has for him next. Go ahead and make your way over to Exodus chapter 3. And while you're turning there, I'll give you a quick overview of what's been going on since Moses was found in that river. Remember that Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter knew that this boy was an Israelite. Because Moses is an Israelite living in Pharaoh's kingdom, he grows up a little differently than his fellow Israelites, who, if you remember, are slaves. Now, we don't know too much about what was going on in his time, but our best guess is that Moses was probably an advocate for his people. He was a voice for his people who were oppressed, and Moses still cared about his fellow Israelites. And we know that because at one point he sees an Egyptian slave master hurting another Israelite. It was his slave, so it was his right to do that, according to the time. It wasn't illegal for him to do that, but Moses saw this and was angered. He didn't like what he was seeing, and so he murdered the Egyptian slave master. Now, obviously, this is not going to be good for Moses, and Pharaoh finds out, and he chases Moses out of Egypt. Moses runs for a long time. He leaves behind his adopted mother and his real mother, his sister, and his family that he's known for now 40 years. He runs to a land called Moab. There, he leaves behind his old life. He's no longer an Egyptian, and he's no longer an Israelite. He's a man without an identity. So Moses restarts. He gets a new family, finds a new wife, and has new children. He leaves it all behind. But God isn't done with him quite yet. One day when Moses was working outside, the Lord appears to him in a burning bush. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 3. We'll start in verse 7 and see what God has to say to Moses. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land into a good, spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." If you remember from last week, the Israelites are crying out to God. They've been enslaved for hundreds of years from the Egyptians, and God hears their prayers finally. The time for the Israelites' redemption is here, and God chooses Moses out of all the people to carry out this plan. So Moses has been gone for quite a few years now, but this doesn't mean that Pharaoh has forgotten anything that Moses has done. Remember, Moses is a murderer in Egypt, and Pharaoh still knows this. Well, God's plan involves Moses approaching Pharaoh. This would be like approaching the President of the United States and demanding something of him. And so God asks Moses to approach Pharaoh and demand that he sets all these slaves free. Pharaoh doesn't take kindly to this, obviously. But that isn't the end of God's plan. Moses will carry out many plagues that God will allow in order to slowly and painfully convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. So every time Pharaoh rejects Moses, Moses brings another plague. And every time that Moses brings a plague, Pharaoh slowly begins to open his hand to release the Israelites. It took many, many, many tries, and Moses finally, on the last attempt, convinces Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Finally, redemption comes for the Israelites. They're set free, and they walk towards the Red Sea, which is a big body of water. As they approach the Red Sea, they turn around, and what they see behind them is Pharaoh's army coming after them. While Pharaoh was defeated back in Egypt, he looked around and he became angry and he became jealous and he wanted to fight against God's plan. I don't understand it fully, but for some reason, all these plagues that Moses brought were not enough to defeat Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, still trying to hold on to control, what little control he had at least, he decided to take his army and send it after the Israelites in order to recapture them or just kill them. So you can imagine that the Israelites are terrified. Well, they turn to Moses and they ask him, they say, "Moses, you've been in charge this whole time. What do we do now?" Moses answered the people. He said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still." Now, I want you to imagine that there's an army chasing after you, and the guy who is in charge tells you to just be still. You'd probably think he was crazy, right? Well, Moses is probably scared, but he truly believes in God, and he tells this to the people, and something miraculous happens. Moses raises his staff, and in that moment, God splits the sea into two. The Israelites are able to walk across the sea and get away from the Egyptians. And God doesn't stop there. When the Egyptians see this, they continue. They walk through the Red Sea, and while the Israelites are safely on the shore, God closes the sea, and it wipes out the entire army of the Egyptians. When I see this, when I read this in the Bible, I see that the reason that God chose Moses was because Moses had crazy amounts of trust for God. It took a while for Moses to build up to trusting God, but what we see is that when Moses had his back against the wall, he wasn't worried. He told the people straight up, "Just be still and God will take care of you." And God took care of them in that moment. We have to pause our story for today, but this is just still only the beginning of Moses' relationship with God. God will continue to push Moses to trust him even more. So before we end our lesson today, let's go through some key points that we can take from this story. First one is this: be ready for God to call you to something. Moses was called basically when he was a baby, and again when he was a 40-year-old adult. Guys, we have no idea what God has in store for us, but what we can prepare for is a yes towards God. I'm not saying that it'll be safe. I'm not saying that it'll even be fun, but what God has for you is a huge plan. And when he calls you, all he wants is a simple yes from us. That's what he got from Moses, and that's what he wants from you too. And the second one is this. I mentioned in the first one that God's plan isn't necessarily going to make us happy or make us safe. Let me read this scripture and you'll see what I'm saying. John 15:18 and 19. It says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." Now, that can be kind of a confusing verse, because Christians, you hear a lot, are supposed to be the people who are supposed to make everybody happy. Well, we do bring joy to the world, but the other thing is that we are against the world. We love the people in it, but what we are trying to do is not make the world happy, but make the world a better place. And we can do that by sharing the gospel and bringing the goodness of God to those people who need him. And unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of people who reject that. They're going to want to continue down their ways when God calls us to share with them a different path. So what John is saying in this verse is that the world will act one way and we will act another way. And that other way is the way that God calls us. And when we act different from the world, people are not going to like that. And number 3, the world is not going to like it, right? We're not going to make everybody happy. But even though that is scary, it is the best option for you. Jeremiah 29:11 says this, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." So I know that God's plan is not always what's going to make us the most happy or what's going to make us the most safe, but it is the best plan for our lives. And we see that laid out in Moses' life. Or Moses' mother had to give him up as a child, or she definitely did not want to do that. Yet, she still did. And the journey that God took Moses on was the best option for him in that life. So when we read this story and when we pick up next week, keep in mind that Moses does not always have a happy heart. He does not always have a happy attitude with what he's doing for God. But the mission that God has for Moses is the most important and most beneficial for Moses' life. And so I encourage you guys with that. When you hear God, when you hear him call you, say yes. And know that the world is going to reject you. And we have to trust in God's plan. Even though it might not be our plan, his plan is better than any plan that we have for ourselves. So, thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you again next week.